Thanks for being a part of ChinaTalk.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Ophir Dayan works at the Institute for National Security Studies based in Tel Aviv. She's a China Middle East policy analyst, also recording this the AM Eastern Time, Tuesday, October 10th. Ophir, talk us through your past few days.
So, if I had to choose one word to describe what Israel and Israelis have been experiencing over the last three and a little more than 3 days, is surreal. I think that things that unfolded on the ground are scenarios that Israelis didn't think possible. It's in a way the worst nightmare of Israelis. I think the past three days were for Israelis a wake up call. We've seen hundreds, almost 1,000 Israelis killed. We've seen, I assume, what to be over 100 Israelis, including civilians and children and the elderly, kidnapped into Gaza. I think it's important to understand how sure Israel was in the strength of its army and in the weakness of Hamas in comparison, and how there is a misconception. There was a huge misconception about the power balance here, and I think many Israelis, including myself, are even now, more than 3 days after this war broke, a bit in disbelief of what's been happening. And again, I'm gonna use the word surreal. We've seen sites; they're very graphic, so I'm not going to repeat them here. But we never thought we're gonna see this sort of fighting taking place inside Israel. We never thought we'd see the sheer number of people kidnapped and murdered by Hamas. And I'm going to say one more thing, which I think it's very important to understand here. We've seen ISIS-styled acts by Hamas, and I think that also is a very important aspect in terms of, first of all, the people killed and abused, but also the psych, the national psych. I think that it adds to the shock and the trauma that we've been experiencing, and since it's taken place in 2023, everything is recorded, everything is on social media, and people are exposed to it. And lastly, I'm going to say that only the sheer number of people missing, the people murdered, means that every single Israeli knows at least one, if not more, of someone who is directly impacted by the fighting, whether it be a murdered individual, a hostage being held in Gaza, someone missing, and I think that's it's a big turning point for Israeli society and for myself in how we view ourselves and our enemies in this region, both in terms of their strength and in terms of their brutality.
Ophir, well, let's tease that out a little bit. What's the sort of before and after? I mean, it is a terrorist organization. They have been bombing Israelis for a long time now. But sort of what about the kind of ISIS, inspired dimension, as well as the scale, sort of changes, how the government and how the people sort of interpret their, I don't know, the broader security environment.
So I'm going to say something that's it's going to be very sad, but for the past 18 years, Israelis got used to being bombarded by Hamas, by rockets, by water shells. We just got used to it, and it's no longer something that is completely shocking or destabilizing to us. We are used to having this mini conflict with Hamas once every few years. But this one is different. I think what makes it different is the surprise. We woke up Saturday morning, 6:30 a.m. Israel time, with uncertainty of what's even happening on Israeli territory. Entire communities were held by Hamas. They were taken over by a terrorist organization. And this surprise of something we never thought possible, and the way that it took the Israeli Defense Forces and the police many, many hours to intervene, I think that's different from other times. But I think what makes it very different than other times, which is, I think, the most destabilizing thing, is that we are used to, I don't want to say sterile warfare, but to bombs and aircraft. In response, we're not used to them infiltrating Israeli territory in this scale, taking, more than 100 Israelis, civilians, hostages, and killing almost 1,000 Israelis.
Uh, what's your sense of the sort of Ophir, why don't you give a little background of China-Israel relations, as well as uh, what China has been pursuing over the past few years in the broader Middle East?
Okay, so I'm gonna start this way. Diplomatic relations between China and Israel has only been a thing since the 90s. So even the broader context of Israeli-China relations is pretty recent in terms of international relations. The relationship between China and Israel is based a lot on economic um, and trade relations. Uh, China is viewed here in Israel as an economic partner, not as a strategic partner in the same way the US is perceived here in Israel. Um, Yet, I'm going to say it this way. Look, even though China is perceived here as a trade partner more than a strategic one, people here like China. They value China. People here travel to China. They buy Chinese products. Before this entire thing started, we even were talking about a planned trip by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to China, a trip that stirred controversy because Netanyahu and his closest compatriots even floated around this idea of China, of this trip being a realignment in the Israeli alliances system, a little more towards China than the U.S. And we need to understand the context that this is coming from. People view China very differently than people in the U.S. view China. Well, people in the U.S. view China as competition, as a threat. In Israel, China is an inspiration. We look at how China builds magnificent structures and huge projects, and here in Israel as well, by the way. So that's how Israelis view China, and I think in this context, it was very disappointing for many Israelis to see the Chinese response, especially compared to the American response and to other Western nations. While President Joe Biden unequivocally supports Israel, gave several statements, is sending, Navy vessels here, sending military assistance. China couldn't even bring itself to properly denounce Hamas. Something that is very basic, and even people as anti-Israel as Ilhan Omar, the Congress member for the U.S., she even condemned Hamas more than China, and no Israeli thought Ilhan Omar would be a better ally of Israel than China. I think that's a bit surreal to see Ilhan Omar saying that she's horrified by the crimes Hamas is committing, and China saying they hope for all sides to remain calm. I think that's a bit surreal for us. This entire idea is magnified by the fact that there is a Chinese citizen, at least one, directly affected by the fighting, and a citizen called Noah. She's a young Israeli, Chinese Israeli, being held in Gaza. Her mom is Chinese. And there was a very viral video of her being kidnapped into Gaza. She has been kidnapped by Hamas. And first of all, if I might say, she's a very beautiful young lady, which, when you look at it, it's just sad. She's there surrounded by Hamas terrorists, and she's saying, "Please don't kill me." And it's been on the cover of many international news outlets, many newspapers, and China where she's a citizen has been, their response was rather disappointing.
So I'm sorry. I think is it, we know her mother is a citizen. I'm not sure she's like a passport holder. Is that confirmed, if you're, or what's the dynamic there?
I think as far as the reports here goes, she's a Chinese citizen. Yes.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's tricky because like you can't, like China doesn't
Yeah,
recognize dual
yeah, yeah.
citizenship,
So
right?
she's not recognized by China as a citizen because she has dual citizenship,
So
which again is a concept that is very foreign to Israelis because there are many Israelis with dual citizenship, so they don't understand why in this case it's not something that prompts reaction.
gotcha. Oh, Ophir, let's take a step back then and talk about you know, China's broader ambitions in the Middle East. We saw them being very proud of brokering this, deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We'll see where that leaves. We'll see where that ends up after, the dust settles from this war. But, what is the relationship that China particularly has been trying to develop with Iran? How is that seen now, following an attack of the magnitude like this?
Look, I must be completely honest with you. I think Israelis are less engaged in the China discussion here in the Middle East. This is something that we people who monitor China very closely. This is something that is very disturbing to us. The average Israeli, I'm not sure even knows or takes account of China's actions here in the Middle East. But I would say though that every interaction between a foreign government and Iran is seen as very negative here in Israel, especially by a government like China, a country that Israelis consider as a friend. I think that while the tension between the US and China is very evident and very understood by analysts here in Israel, the average Israeli is less aware of it. And they view China as, as a friendly country. So it's lack of ability to condemn Hamas properly. And, more than that, it's alignment with Iran is seen very negatively here. And they will be viewed even more negatively when Israelis will be more aware of this connection.
So if you're, let me read you this tweet. I'm curious for your response. Ryan Haas from Brookings tweeted, "Time will tell, but my expectation is that China's cautious response to Hamas's attack in Israel will expose the limits of PRC influence in the region. Beijing historically has been wary of being drawn into taking sides. I don't expect that to change." Thoughts or response to that sentiment of yours?
I think that's a very good analysis of what's been happening. While the United States is extremely involved in what's happening over the last little more than three days, China is not as involved. Um, Rhetorically, by not being able to condemn Hamas like other nations did, but also on the ground, I want to remind our listeners that a few years back, China even proposed to mediate between Israel and the Palestinians. Again, it did the same, I think, last year as well. And those are attempts that Israelis are aware of. They know that China views itself as some sort of a potential mediator in the never-ending Middle Eastern conflict. Even a survey that was conducted a few months ago with Arabs, young Arabs in the Middle East, showed that they prefer China to the U.S. as a mediator. But in times like this, a country that views itself as a possible mediator, should be more involved and not, sit on the sidelines and say, bad people on both sides. And that's practically what China has been doing so far. I think China is also showing its lack of nuance of what's been happening here. The sides here are not even, especially when you ask Israelis. And China kind of makes this comparison. And while the United States is sending military assistance, which is, again, very, very unusual, it also show solidarity on other levels. The White House was colored blue and white as the Eiffel Tower and the Brandenburg Gate in Germany. We don't see that solidarity from China. But I think it's important to understand how, Europeans and Americans are also very familiar to Israelis. They travel here. And although there are many Chinese tourists in Israel, Israelis know less about Chinese culture. They know less Chinese individuals. So even on the human level and on social media, they interact less with Chinese people than they interact with Americans or with Europeans and other English-speaking countries. So China is, I would say, cautiously unfelt here by Israelis, and I would even say by Israeli leadership.
Yeah. There's sort of the context, I guess, of like ISIS style exposure, I think, which China and the Chinese, people as well as Chinese leadership really hasn't had. I mean, in terms of terrorist attacks, right? We've had some knife stuff and a threatened car bomb, which has kind of been it over the past 15 years. And I think that's very different than, in European, bombings and killings across Europe as well as in the U.S. and in the Middle East, where America had troops in Iraq and Afghanistan for years and years. So I think there's sort of the comparisons are maybe easier to draw given the proximity of sort of similar experience, I guess.
And I think it's important also to note that in terms of values, there is more similarity between the values on which Israel is built upon and American and Western values. It's easier for, democratic countries like the US and the UK understand how it is felt by Israelis when a non-democratic society is in conflict with a democratic society, which is something that is not shared by China.
What's a kind of interesting parallel that was pointed out by your colleague Tuvia Gehring, who couldn't join us today because he was called up, is the sort of echo that you're seeing in China's response to the Russia-Ukraine fight and the way it's portrayed on official media to how they're talking about Hamas's attacks and Israel's response, where you basically have this this narrative of the devastation caused in this case by over the past year by Ukraine, in this case by Israel. Sort of no real context on like why those things are happening. And then one or two sort of nods, or maybe not even a nod. It was sort of incredible, I thought, in Siwen Lianbo, how they didn't even mention the fact that hundreds of Israelis civilians were killed, which is why you saw those you saw the images in the first half of the sort of little clip of attacks in Gaza happening in the first place, and then you kind of close it with a, by the way, this is actually all America's fault because they're the bad actors. So it is sort of like a surreal playbook it's surreal, but like, I guess kind of understandable given that she has this relationship with Putin and sees them as a strategic ally, but to sort of, in a sense, put Putin's a superpower or sort of superpower in Russia on the same level as Hamas is just a wild thing to see happening in real time.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with that.
Ophir, thanks for being a part of ChinaTalk.
Thank you very much, Jordan.